How often do we stop for a moment and think nothing of it? To tie a bootlace, to take a photograph, or to step into the bushes and spend a penny. Most of the time those little interruptions mean absolutely nothing. But on the morning of the 28th of April 1995, a handful of ordinary delays left 5 people a few moments behind the rest of their party as they made their way through New Zealand's Cave Creek. By the time they caught up, the people ahead of them had vanished. Less than a minute earlier, they had been standing on a viewing platform. Now there was simply nothing but a few faint cries drifting up from somewhere below. The story of the Cave Creek disaster had really begun the previous afternoon. The outdoor recreation course at Tai Potini Polytechnic was too large to visit Cave Creek all at once, so the students had been divided into 2 groups. Group A would go on Thursday the 27th of April 1995, and Group B would follow the next day. On that Thursday afternoon, Group A made the journey to Cave Creek, a rugged limestone landscape hidden within New Zealand's Paparoa National Park. Joining them was Shirley Slatter, the information manager at the nearby Punakaiki Visitor Centre, who had agreed to accompany the students and introduce them to one of the area's lesser-known natural wonders. Their destination was a small viewing platform perched high above the creek itself, a timber structure built to give visitors a spectacular view down into the narrow gorge some 30 metres below. It was relatively small, measuring around 6 metres long and 4 metres wide. It was the sort of excursion Shirley had made many times before, and as the students made their way onto the platform to admire the scenery, there seemed no reason to believe that this visit would be any different. And then she noticed something she had never seen before. Beneath the weight of the group, the timber structure appeared to flex slightly, almost as though it were moving in the wind. To Shirley it felt unusual. She had visited Cave Creek many times before, and could not remember ever seeing the structure behave in quite that way. As more of the students stepped onto the platform, Shirley kept her eyes on the front of the structure. It seemed to be moving slightly, almost wavering in the wind, and although she wasn't overly concerned, it was unusual enough for her to call out, "Oh, hey guys, half on at a time, I think, and no jumping." A few of the students laughed. If anything, the movement became something of a joke. It seemed perfectly safe to everyone there. Yet the uneasy feeling stayed with her, and by the time she left Cave Creek that afternoon, she had already decided that someone needed to take another look at the structure. Later that afternoon, when the group returned to Punakaiki, Shirley mentioned what she had seen to her newly appointed manager, Stephen O'Day. Steve had been in the role of field centre manager for only a matter of weeks, and was still finding his feet, learning the tracks, facilities and responsibilities that came with managing one of New Zealand's most spectacular national parks. After listening to Shirley's concerns, he agreed to accompany the next day's student group and take a look at it for himself. It seemed an entirely sensible decision. The platform had stood above the gorge for exactly a year. Hundreds, perhaps even thousands of visitors had walked onto it, admired the view, and left again without incident. To anyone looking at it, there was no reason to believe that the structure was anything other than safe. Neither Shirley nor Steve could possibly have known that hidden beneath the timber decking was a structure that should never have been built in the first place. And by agreeing to spend the day at Cave Creek, Stephen O'Day had unknowingly altered the course of his own life. The structure itself had been erected in April 1994, as part of a wider plan to encourage visitors into parts of Paparoa National Park that many people simply overlooked. From above, Cave Creek was a spectacular sight, and the Department of Conservation hoped that by providing a dedicated viewing area, visitors would be less tempted to wander off the marked tracks and damage the fragile landscape. There was nothing wrong with the idea. The problem lay in how the platform had been designed and built. At first glance, the structure looked perfectly ordinary. It had even been assembled off-site in kit form before being flown into Cave Creek by helicopter and erected on the edge of the gorge. For an entire year it had carried visitors without incident. Beneath the timber decking, however, lay a series of flaws that, taken together, made the platform little more than an accident waiting to happen. The design had not been produced by a structural engineer, nor by anyone with formal training in timber construction. Instead, the task had fallen to a Department of Conservation mechanic, one of many staff members who, in an organisation struggling with limited resources and tight budgets, often found themselves carrying responsibilities far beyond their experience. The problems did not end there. When the timber structure was assembled, some of the supporting piles failed to line up properly with the timber bearers above them. Rather than repositioning the piles, pieces of packing timber were simply inserted to bridge the gaps. Worse still, critical parts of the structure that had originally been intended to be bolted together were instead secured with ordinary nails after the appropriate drill had not been brought to the site, and rather than delaying the work, the decision was made to continue anyway. No calculations had ever been carried out to determine how the platform would behave under load. No engineer had checked the design, and although the structure had been intended to carry no more than 5 people at a time, no sign was ever erected to tell visitors that such a limit existed. By the time the platform opened to the public, the seeds of the disaster had already been sown, and for the next 12 months none of those shortcomings mattered. Then, on the morning of the 28th of April 1995, Group B set out to make the same journey that their classmates had made the previous day. They were accompanied by their tutor, John Skilton, Shirley Slatter, and Stephen O'Day. No one heading out to Cave Creek that morning had any reason to believe that they were walking towards disaster. As the group made their way along the narrow forest track, they gradually became spread out. The path had narrowed, and the students were now walking 2 abreast. At the front of the group were John Skilton and Stephen O'Day, leading the way towards the viewing platform, while some distance behind them walked Shirley Slatter. Needing the toilet, John stepped off the track and allowed the rest of the students to pass before looking around for somewhere private to go. At the back, Shirley had paused to wait for 2 students who had fallen behind. When they finally caught up and passed her, she too stepped into the bushes for a quick bathroom break. Ahead of them, one of the students from the main group had stopped to remove his jumper and tie it around his waist. As he did so, the 2 students Shirley had been waiting for caught up with him, and moments later Shirley herself rejoined them. The 4 of them were only a short distance from the turn-off to the viewing platform. Interruptions so ordinary that none of them gave it a second thought. Then they heard a noise. John had only just begun to urinate when he heard it too. At first, none of them understood what they were hearing. At around 11:25 that morning, 18 people stood on the viewing deck, looking down into the gorge below. Then, without warning, the platform lurched. For a brief moment it tilted to an angle of around 30 degrees, hanging there just long enough for those standing upon it to realise that something was terribly wrong. Then it gave way completely. The entire structure tore free from its supports and plunged into the gorge below, carrying everyone on it down with it. The collapse happened so quickly that there was scarcely time to react. Those further back on the track would later remember hearing little more than a sudden crash from somewhere ahead, and then came silence. Back along the track, the 5 people who had fallen behind heard the commotion ahead of them, but could not immediately understand what had happened. It was only when they hurried towards the viewing platform that they were confronted by an almost unimaginable sight. The platform had vanished. Where, only moments before, 18 people had been standing, there was now nothing but empty space above the gorge. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then, from somewhere below, came the first cries. Faint at first, drifting up through the trees, and then growing more desperate as the terrible reality of what had happened began to sink in. Shirley and the others hurried to the edge and looked down into the ravine beneath them. The scene below was one of utter devastation. The platform lay shattered among the trees at the bottom of the gorge. Amid the wreckage lay the people who had been standing on it only moments earlier. Some were motionless. Others were crying out for help. Calling down to those below to remain calm, Shirley and John quickly worked out a plan of action. Their first thought was to send Mark Trainer back to the vehicles and use the Department of Conservation's two-way radio to raise the alarm. Shirley began writing instructions explaining how to use the radio and what information needed to be passed on, but she quickly realised the plan was too complicated if no one were to answer. There was no time for misunderstandings. Changing the plan, Shirley decided that it would be better if two of them returned to the vehicles, so she and Mark would go. Meanwhile, John, together with Leanne Wheeler and Darren Gamble, would make their way down into the gorge to help the injured, as he had first aid training. Then the two groups separated. John, Leanne and Darren would head down into the creek. John prepared the two students for what they might find as best he could. It was a difficult and dangerous descent, made even more treacherous by loose rocks, tangled vegetation, and the knowledge that every second mattered. At the bottom, the true scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. Bodies lay among the splintered remains of the platform. Some of the victims had been killed instantly by the 30-metre fall. Others had suffered appalling injuries. A few were still conscious, calling out in pain and confusion, trying to understand what had just happened to them. In the midst of the chaos, the survivors did what they could. They comforted the injured, spoke to those who were still responsive, and tried desperately to help their friends. The three rescuers and the injured and the dead were utterly alone in one of the most remote corners of the national park. Above them, however, another problem was beginning to emerge. The nearest road was some distance away, and help was not coming quickly. Minutes slowly turned into an hour, and then into more than an hour. Shirley and Mark immediately set off back up the track, walking at first and then breaking into a jog. When they finally reached the vehicles, Shirley looked at her watch. It was 11:44 a.m. Nearly 20 minutes had already passed since the platform had collapsed. Then came another cruel setback. The department vehicle had been driven in by Stephen O'Day, and the keys were in his pocket at the bottom of the gorge. Without them, the radio would not work. Desperately they checked the other vans, but they too had been left without keys. There was no way of calling for help. The pair quickly agreed that Mark would have to run for assistance. Before he left, however, he helped Shirley gather together as much warm clothing and first aid equipment as they could find. Then, with remarkable presence of mind, Shirley wrote a note. "This is an emergency. 111 police. Approximately 15 people have fallen 100 feet. Cave Creek top platform collapsed. We need helicopters, scoop net, medics, ambulance, crash kit, personnel." She added telephone numbers and further instructions before sending Mark on his way. As he ran down Bullock Creek Road, Shirley packed the clothing and first aid supplies and began making her way back towards the accident site. Along the road she encountered two cyclists and asked them to catch Mark, lend him a bicycle and help him raise the alarm. One of them, Bruce Margetts, was fit enough to catch him. By then Mark had already run a considerable distance, driven on by the knowledge that every minute mattered. Eventually he reached a nearby house and, at 12:16 p.m, telephoned emergency services. Back down in the gorge, John, Leanne and Darren did what they could for the injured, comforting the survivors and administering first aid where they could. Then, an hour after the collapse, Shirley returned with the supplies. She asked John, "Where's Steve? I need the keys." John's answer was immediate. "Steve's dead." The keys to the radio were in Stephen O'Day's pocket. There would be no easy way of calling for help. For those trapped at the bottom of the resurgence, every passing moment must have felt like an eternity. As news of the disaster slowly spread, emergency services from across the west coast began racing towards Cave Creek. Ambulances were dispatched from both Greymouth and Westport, while helicopters from the Royal New Zealand Air Force were called in from Christchurch. But the remoteness of the site worked cruelly against the rescuers. There were no roads leading directly to the viewing platform, and no easy way of reaching the injured lying at the bottom of the gorge. Even the helicopters could not land at the accident site. No matter how quickly help arrived, the final journey would have to be made on foot, with rescuers carrying their equipment through the forest and down the steep slopes of the ravine. And by the time the first police officer finally reached the scene, almost 2 hours had passed since the platform collapsed. For some, it was already too late. Later, Dr. John Sage would conclude that 12 of the 14 people who died had suffered injuries so severe that no medical treatment, no matter how quickly it arrived, could have saved them. But in those long minutes after the collapse, nobody at Cave Creek could possibly have known that. One by one, the dead and injured were lifted from the gorge and carried back through the forest. What had begun as an ordinary educational field trip had become one of New Zealand's worst peacetime disasters. In the end, only 4 of the 18 people who had been standing on the platform survived. Stephen Hannon, who was left tetraplegic by his injuries. Sam Lucas, who survived with serious injuries. Stacey Mitchell, who escaped with relatively minor physical injuries but endured years of psychological trauma. And Caroline Smith, who later spoke openly about her struggle with survivor's guilt. 13 of the dead were young students from Taiputini Polytechnic. They were Alison Blackman, 22, Paul Chisholm, 21, Anne-Marie Cook, 19, Jodie Davis, 18, Peter Shaw, 18, Barry Hobson, 28, Abram Larmour, age 20, Catherine McCarthy, 17, Scott Murray, 23, Kit Pawsey, 17, Matthew Reed, 19, Deanne Reed, 20, and Evan Stewart, 19. The 14th was Stephen O'Day, the newly appointed manager. He was just 30 years old, and the following day had been due to travel north to celebrate his son's 8th birthday. For Shirley Slatter, the loss was almost impossible to comprehend. In the weeks, months and years that followed, she would carry with her an impossible question, one that haunts so many survivors of disaster. Could anything have been done to change what happened at Cave Creek? It was a question that would soon be asked by an entire nation. The answer would prove to be both shocking and deeply embarrassing. In the days following the disaster, the Department of Conservation ordered an immediate inspection of its viewing structures across New Zealand. More than 100 platforms and bridges were closed as a precaution, and a number of them required urgent repairs before they could be considered safe again. At Cave Creek, however, attention quickly turned to the shattered remains of the platform lying at the bottom of the gorge. The more investigators examined the wreckage, the more troubling the picture became. This had not been a freak accident, nor had the platform been brought down by bad weather, rotten timber, or some hidden defect that nobody could have foreseen. Instead, investigators discovered that the structure should never have been considered safe in the first place. The viewing platform had not been designed by a structural engineer. There had been no engineering calculations, no proper assessment of how the structure would behave under load, and no independent checking of the design before construction began. The problems did not end there. Parts of the structure that had been designed to be bolted together were instead secured with ordinary nails because the necessary equipment to install the bolts was not available on site. It was also found that some of those nails had either completely missed or barely penetrated the beams below. When the platform became overloaded on the 28th of April 1995, the nails simply pulled free and the entire structure tore away from its supports. A commission of inquiry was established to determine exactly how such a disaster had been allowed to happen. Its conclusions were damning. From an engineering standpoint, the commission concluded that the platform had not been constructed in accordance with sound building practice, and that this had resulted in a total and catastrophic failure. But its criticism went much further than the platform itself. It spoke of inadequate systems, poor communication, unclear lines of responsibility, and an organisation that had failed to ensure that even basic standards of safety were being met. The Department of Conservation was still a relatively young organisation. Formed in 1987, It had inherited thousands of kilometres of walking tracks, bridges, huts and visitor facilities spread across some of the most remote parts of New Zealand. And yet the resources available to maintain and improve that vast estate had never kept pace with the scale of the task. In short, Cave Creek had not been caused by a single mistake or a single individual. It had been the product of a system that had failed at almost every level. The viewing platform was never rebuilt. Perhaps it never should be. The absence of that platform says more than any memorial ever could. Today, visitors still walk through Paparoa National Park and still pause to look out across the limestone gorge. It is difficult to imagine that such a peaceful place could have witnessed one of New Zealand's worst peacetime disasters. Yet for one person in particular, Cave Creek would never truly be a place of scenery or natural beauty again. Shirley Slatter had walked away from the disaster, but she did not leave it behind. For years afterwards, she spoke of the immense grief and guilt she carried, haunted by the knowledge that she had stood on the platform the previous day and realised that something was not right. She had done what any conscientious member of staff would have done and raised her concerns, never imagining that the simple act of asking her manager to take a look would set in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. And then there was the cruelest irony of all. On the morning of the 28th of April 1995, a toilet break and a handful of ordinary interruptions had delayed her only by a matter of moments. Those few seconds became the difference between life and death. Stephen O'Day never returned from Cave Creek. Shirley did. And perhaps that empty space above the gorge still asks the same question that has lingered ever since that April morning. How could something so preventable ever have been allowed to happen? Now, to me, this is a clear case of a structure which was designed and built by a person who, through no fault of their own, was completely unqualified. But they were put in that position by business pressures. Our condolences go out to everyone who was affected by this terrible tragedy. And despite the tragedy, I hope you appreciated the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.